Good morning. It's 8 o'clock and it's been raining. The world is happy today. The frogs are still singing. The birds are out and the clouds are so low. Everything's super loud. It's really nice. It's like 72 this morning. It's awesome. I have to sit out here all day even though it's rainy today. We're on chapter 22. All right, so we left off with little Lloyd was supposed to close the sunroof. He did, then reached around his mother and stopped the racket the panic button had started. The quiet was a welcome relief from the spectacle we'd been making of ourselves. I wiped a hand on my coat, marveling that I was able to break the grip I'd had on the steering wheel. As I slowed to normal speed on the highway, I noticed that ice had begun to collect on the sides of the windshield where the wipers had swept it. Now we're in the south. There's ice falling from the sky. What do we do? This stuff's freezing, I said, as my blood pressure jumped a notch. I'd just run a road race that hadn't worried me half as much as the thought of driving home on icy roads. You'd think the weather would know it's March and not January, wouldn't you? But Hazel Marie and little Lloyd weren't paying attention to my problems. They were busy carrying on over each other. "Lloyd, baby, oh, sweetheart," Hazel Marie cried, as the two of them wrapped themselves around each other, crying and squeezing and laughing all the time. "Where'd you come from? How'd you find me? Oh, my goodness, I'm glad to see you." Then, as they untangled themselves and little Lloyd climbed between the seats to get in the back, Hazel Marie turned to me. "Oh, Miss Julia, I've never been so glad to see anybody in my life. How'd you know to come out there? I called Lillian, but she didn't know how to get to you. It was like a miracle when I looked out the window of that RV and saw your car. I couldn't believe it. Seemed like I just Seemed like I just managed to slip and call Lillian on Wilson T's cell phone." So I told her how we'd follow the trail of gold charms she'd laid out along her way, and that we'd been at a certain Jerry Johnson's place, at which time little Lloyd interrupted to tell her that it was the Jerry Johnson of some little racing fame. Before she got too impressed, I went on to tell her how the same Jerry Johnson had helped Mr. Pickens sneak off and leave us in order to rescue her from Bigelow's local garage, where it was plain to see she had not been. Instead of immediately putting to rest our fears about her safety in the past few days, she said, "Who's Mr. Pickens?" "Mr. J.D. Pickens, the private investigator I hired to find you." "You hired a private investigator? Oh, Miss Julia." Tears welled up in her eyes, and before I knew it, she leaned over the console and hugged me, an intimacy I'd never much cared for and had avoided whenever I was able to, especially when I was trying to drive. "I can't believe you'd do that for me," she said, her voice breaking as she wiped her eyes. "And why not, I'd like to know? You think I'd just let you go off and never hear from you again with this child mourning you the way he's done? To say nothing of Lillian and, well, me. No, siree, that's not the way I operate." "Look," little Lloyd yelled. I nearly had a heart attack thinking Bigelow and Wilson T had confiscated one of those pickups we'd seen and come after us. But little Lloyd was waving and flapping his hands out the side window. "It's Jerry and Mr. Pickens." I caught the flash of Mr. Johnson's red sports car as he whizzed past us heading for the speedway. So they'd found my note and were riding to the rescue. Somewhat late, I might add. "Look at that!" Little Lloyd was kneeling on the back seat looking out the rear window. "He's doing 180. I glanced in the rearview mirror in time to see Mr. Johnson's car skid into a turn that slung him around in the opposite direction. Then he was coming fast up behind us. Just as the little red car filled our rear window, Mr. Johnson swung out beside us, cruising at our speed. Mr. Pickens rolled down his window and had the nerve to point his finger at me. Then at the gas station up ahead. I pursed my mouth at being given orders again, especially since we'd been doing so well without him. As Mr. Johnson spurted on ahead and pulled into the gas station, I decided that the better part of wisdom was to do what I was told. So I turned in and stopped beside them. It wouldn't hurt to have their help, since I doubted Bigelow and Wilson T. were through with us. Mr. Pickens got out, leaving Mr. Johnson in the car with his arm crooked on the rolled-down window, watching us. The motor of his car rumbled as he waited beside the road. The storm clouds on Mr. Pickens' face as he approached us were worse than what was overhead. He came to my side of the car, and I lowered the window. He put his hands on his hips and said, "What the hell you think you're doing?" "Your job, Mr. Pickens, and watch your language. This is Hazel Marie Puckett, who, as you can see, is no longer in the clutches of criminals." He leaned down to glare across at her, and did it a good long time. She gave him a sweet smile. "Glad to meet you." He grunted, took another long look, and then said to me, "Get in the back, I'm driving." "I'll have you know," I started. "The roads are icing up." He cut me off, opened my door, and waggled his hand for me to get out and move on. I did, crawling into the back seat with little Lloyd, fuming at Mr. Pickens' reassumption of the driving responsibilities. I don't know why all the men on the face of the earth think they're the only ones who know how to drive. "Look," little Lloyd screamed in my ear. "It's them! They're following us!" Sure enough, a white pickup truck slowed as it came abreast of the filling station. 3 men in the cab looked over at us, taking in my car and Mr. Johnson's, and then spurted out of sight. "Oh no," Hazel Marie said, sliding down in the seat. "The one in the middle was Wilson T. He's still after me. What are we going to do?" "Don't worry, Mama," little Lloyd said with more confidence than I had. "Mr. Pickens and Jerry will take care of us." Mr. Pickens gave the child a quick smile. "Hold on a minute," he said, and went over to consult with Mr. Johnson. When he came back, he slid behind the wheel without a word as to what they'd concluded. Sorry. He reached over and turned on the defroster, which I'd forgotten about in all the excitement, glanced at Hazel Marie in her Wednesday night date dress, and said, "Cold?" Then he jacked up the heater and pulled out behind Mr. Johnson's car. As I sat steaming in the back seat, I began to think of how much catching up we needed to do with Hazel Marie. Questions flooded my mind, but the atmosphere in the car wasn't conducive to a detailed interrogation. At a stoplight in Rockingham, Mr. Pickens came out of his coat. "Sorry, y'all, I just got up." And handed it to Hazel Marie. She was shivering, even though the car was warm. I'd had my mind on too many other things to have noticed her miserable state. I declare Mr. Pickens could make me mad enough to spit, and then do something so nice that I had to somewhat reevaluate my opinion of it. Although he undid me again because he kept flicking his eyes in Hazel Marie's direction instead of keeping his mind on his business. Of course, I was familiar with Hazel Marie's effect on men in general, and by now familiar with Mr. Pickens' propensity for women in general. Hazel Marie would have to be cautioned about him, although you'd think she'd have learned her lesson by now. I leaned my head back for a minute, feeling worn out from keeping him in line, to say nothing of all the perils to life and limb we'd so recently been subjected to, and that I'd had to overcome on my own. Then I straightened up. "Where are we going, Mr. Pickens?" "Back to Jerry's." "Do you think that's wise? Don't you think those men in the truck recognize Mr. Johnson and that souped-up red car of his? And Wilson T'd certainly know my car. He can put 2 and 2 together, as well as the next person. Besides, Hazel Marie needs to get home, and that's where I think we should go." He gave me a quick look in the rearview mirror from those hot black eyes and said, "I know what I'm doing, so let me do it." I sighed, because here we were going at each other again. The man just would not brook a question, much less a more than reasonable suggestion. Then I thought of something else. If you think we're going to fiddle around here while you help Mr. Johnson find his lucky charm, I remind you that your job for me isn't over until we get Hazel Marie home." Hazel Marie glanced back at me, then at Mr. Pickens, wondering, I was sure, at my forbearance of his intolerable behavior. Little Lloyd kept reaching up to touch her, making sure she was safe. "Have you noticed the weather?" Mr. Pickens asked, with an unattractive touch of sarcasm. "It's worse to the west of us." I gave up and concentrated on his driving. The streets through Rockingham were getting slushy, and we passed a wreck in which the two drivers were standing out in the freezing stuff while they examined the damage. "Be careful, Mr. Pickens," I said as I felt our wheels slip when we pulled away from a stop sign. "You want to drive?" "Well, no, I don't believe I do." "Then let me do it." "I'm happy for you to. I'm just pointing out the road conditions." He reached a hand back and, to my surprise, patted my knee. "Don't get yourself in an uproar, hon. I'll get us there safe and sound. We'll wait out the road conditions at Jerry's, where I doubt Bigelow would want to show his face. Then we'll get you all to Abbotsville. Does that sound like a plan to you?" "It does, and I thank you for letting me know what you have in mind. You're always thinking, Mr. Pickens, but I declare I wish you'd remind me of it every now and again." By the time we got to the asphalt road that led to Mr. Johnson's place of business, Mr. Pickens had the car in low gear, steering carefully and more slowly than he was accustomed to doing. Mr. Johnson, in his colorful car, was inching along in front of us. I noticed the trees hanging over the road, beginning to sag with ice while our tires crunched on the road. I thought of something else to worry about. What if Mr. Johnson loses power? We'll freeze to death out here in the country. "He's got a generator. Now listen to me, hon. You're paying me to do the worrying, and I wish you'd let me do it. Believe me, I can do it better by myself." "He probably can, Miss Julia," little Lloyd said, adding his reassurance to Mr. Pickens's. So I decided to let him, unless I thought of something he might have forgotten. Mr. Pickens followed Mr. Johnson as he turned into the lot at Jerry Johnson's racing place of business. Hazel Marie sat up and looked around, holding Mr. Pickens' coat around her shoulders. "Wait till I come around," Mr. Pickens said. "I'll walk you both to the door. It's not iced over yet, but there'll be slick spots." But Hazel Marie and little Lloyd got out on their own, holding on to each other as they made their way to the entrance, where Mr. Johnson waited for them. I managed to get across the front seat and hold on to the door until Mr. Pickens got to me. "Hold on," he said, putting an arm around me. "We don't want to break anything." I must say that steadying myself against his strong arm made walking on ice a comforting experience. Hazel Marie had missed something by not waiting for him, but young bones can afford to take chances. Mr. Johnson stood, grinning at the door. "Here comes Wonder Woman," he bellowed, his voice bouncing off the walls. "I swear, Miss Julia, you're so good at finding things, I'm about ready to hire you myself. Get on in here where it's warm and tell us how you found this good-looking woman. Was Bobby Bigelow there? Didn't see anything of mine, did you? Hey there, little Boyd. Thought you'd gone off and left us. You're one heck of a detective, and I'm ready to put you to work." Little Lloyd softly corrected the name he'd been called without making an issue of it. Like me, he always appreciated hospitality in any form he could get it. I declare Mr. Johnson was more wound up, if possible, than he'd been before. I wondered if he needed medication, but of course worry does that to some people. Even though I didn't personally hold with superstition, I could understand his anxiety about his lucky charm. Lord knows he'd suffered enough anxiety over Hazel Marie to sympathize with anybody who'd lost anything, especially something he believed, against all scientific evidence, would keep him in one piece on the racetrack. Now that I'd had some racing experience, I knew he took his life in his hands every time he got in one of those cut-down trucks he had in the garage. I'd have found another line of business if it had been me. There was only one mechanic in the garage, a man Mr. Johnson called Curtis, as we passed through on the way to the lounge. He waved at us and said he'd put the coffee on. "I guess I've lost my mind," Mr. Johnson said, ushering us into the lounge. "But with this weather, I'd sent most of the crew on ahead to Phoenix. I'm hoping against hope J.D., that you'll find my charm and make the trip worthwhile. If it don't turn up, I'm just going to sit down and bawl." Hazel Marie looked at him with a frown on her face, not understanding where he was coming from. Mr. Johnson did take some getting used to. As I headed for the coffee pot, Mr. Pickens assigned himself to take charge. "All right, Miss Julia, let's have it. How'd you and the boy know to go to the Speedway?" Well, it was like this. Hazel Marie called Lillian this morning and told her she was in an RV in a field at the North Carolina Speedway. Then we happened to call Lillian right afterward and found that out. Then little Lloyd looked up directions on the computer. After that, it was simple. Too bad you had to go off somewhere and miss it all. I ignored his mumbling about needing to check out Bigelow's house and shop. "Mr. Johnson," I went on, "I hope you don't mind us using your electronic equipment, since it was a good cause." "Not at all," he yelled, a wide grin on his face. "Wish I could have seen their faces when you showed up at the track." "You should have seen us," little Lloyd broke in, loud enough to rival Mr. Johnson. "Miss Julia outran 'em all. When she got Mama in the car, they came after us in the RV, but she went around the track like Bobby LaBonnie." "That's a fact?" Mr. Pickens said, his eyebrows raised halfway up his head. Skeptical was what he was. "Yeah, they spun out and wrecked on the number 4 turn, but we just kept on going." Mr. Johnson, though, was so astounded he almost spilled his coffee. "Y'all left the track?" he bellowed. "Why, that thing's got a 25-degree bank on the 3rd and 4th turn, and just about as bad on 1 and 2. "Yes, sir, we did." Little Lloyd had to stop to get his breath. "And Miss Julia didn't wreck or anything." Mr. Pickens tried not to be impressed, but I knew he had to be. "Now, Miss Puckett, Hazel Marie," he said, "we all want to know what happened to you." Hazel Marie huddled up in his coat as she took an easy chair and warmed her hands on the cup of coffee I gave her. "First off," Mr. Pickens said, "tell us about this boyfriend of yours." "He's not my boyfriend," she snapped, surprising me with this show of spirit and relieving me of any lingering concern about having a church fundraiser in the family. "Sorry," Mr. Pickens favored her with one of his smiles, but it didn't register very high on her scale. "Hazel Marie," I said, hitching up in my chair, "tell us where you've been for the past 2 days and 3 nights. We've been out of our minds with worry, and you don't even know the half of it. Sheriff's departments all over the place have been looking for Bigelow and Wilson T., and you along with them. On top of that, Mr. Johnson here is losing his livelihood because of those two, and something has to be done about it. So start off and don't leave anything out." She put a hand up to her forehead and rubbed it, shaking her head. "I didn't know what was going on, Miss Julia. It all happened so fast. When Wilson T. came by for me," she looked up confused. "When was it? Wednesday night? We were halfway to Asheville when Wilson T. got this call on his cell phone. He turned around real quick and told me he had a business emergency he had to take care of, and off we went to his cousin's garage at Jessup Mountain. Well, when we got there, all these men were scurrying around, working on a racing truck, and Bobby Bigelow was in the offices piling up files and papers and so on, stacking them in boxes like he was moving. He and Wilson T. talked and seemed to argue a little. I wasn't paying much attention, except I heard them say something about meeting in Phoenix and then going on to California. I kept telling Wilson T. that I was hungry and we were going to miss the movie if he didn't hurry up and leave. I couldn't understand why we had to be there in the first place. I mean, according to Wilson T., it's Bobby Bigelow's business, and he just enjoys being on the sidelines of a race team." She stopped and looked at Mr. Pickens, who told her something she didn't know. "The sheriff raided the place the next day. Bigelow must have known it was coming." "Raided?" she whispered, then seemed to put 2 and 2 together. "That's why they got in such a hurry later on, and maybe why Bigelow was so mad that Wilson T. had brought me along. See, something was wrong with their racing truck. The mechanic kept working on it while Bigelow and Wilson T. loaded the vans with the office stuff. Well, it got way up in the night and no sign of us leaving, and I started looking for a phone, but they'd been packed up. I was real mad by that time and would have walked out if we hadn't have been so far back in the woods." You were there all night? I asked, recalling my own restless night. What did you do all that time? Begged to go home most of it, she said, frowning at the memory. Wilson T. kept putting me off. Said he had to help Bobby, and he'd take me home when the crew left. But they were still working on that racing truck, running the motor and tinkering with it, and Bobby Bigelow getting more and more upset and nervous. I finally dropped off to sleep on the couch for a while and woke up when I heard Bigelow and Wilson T. arguing something awful in the shop. Bigelow was mad because the race truck still wasn't right. Said they'd have to take it back to Rockingham where there was better equipment. See, I think they were planning to go to Phoenix that night, and now they couldn't. Anyway, he gave Wilson T. some things to keep safe for him and told him that they all had to stick together. And, he said, they had to stay in the state longer than they'd planned to, and he couldn't afford to let me tell anybody where they were. That's when I got scared and finally found somebody's cell phone and called home. And that's when they locked me in the RV, and that's when I knew I was really in trouble. She stopped again, her eyes getting bigger as something dropped into place. Jerry Johnson! She turned her big eyes on him. That's you, isn't it? I heard them talking about you. You're the reason they didn't want to come back to Rockingham. Bobby Bigelow said he didn't want to see you until you were nothing but a blur in his driver's rearview mirror. Mr. Johnson jumped up from his chair, so agitated he could hardly speak, a phenomenon in itself. I knew it! I knew they was trying to get at me. He whirled around and faced Hazel Marie. Did you see anything that belonged to me? My lucky charm's missing, and I know they got it. She leaned back from his booming voice. No, I don't know what they had. They loaded up computers and boxes and papers and what looked like rags and junk to me. Mr. Johnson smacked his fist into his hand. Thieves, that's what they are. Just low-down, sneaking thieves. As far as charms are concerned, Hazel Marie went on, I do believe some are lucky. When Wilson T. snatched the phone away from me, I pulled one off my bracelet and threw it under a counter, hoping somebody would figure out what was happening to me. And then there was the second one I'd left when we stopped at Gastonia, where I'd tried to call again. I'd sure like to have them back in case I need them again. I've got one, Mama, little Lloyd said, plunging his hand into his pocket. See, it's the one you left in the phone at Deputy Bates. It's the one you left in the phone, and Deputy Bates has the other one. They worked just the way you wanted and led us right to you. Oh, I'm so glad to get it back, she said, the remaining charms on her bracelet clashing together as she reached for it. I hated to pull them off, but I didn't know what else to do. Bigelow was so awful to me. I was scared to death of him, and he made Wilson T. watch me like a hawk. I was so mad at Wilson T. because he wouldn't stand up to him, just did everything Bigelow told him to, and not taking up for me at all. Then I got him into big trouble. Bigelow was so mad he threatened to lock him up with me when I managed to make those phone calls. She smiled, pleased with herself. More than once, too. I declare, Miss Julia, Wilson T.'s not real bright. I don't know why I hadn't noticed it before. Dang his hide. Don't listen, little Lloyd. No, ma'am, I won't, little Lloyd smiled, a dreamy look on his face as he hung over her chair and every word out of her mouth. Why, that sorry thing, I said. And he kept you locked up in the RV all this time? Just about. We left Jessup Mountain right after I managed to call home, and they drove way out of the way down to South Carolina on the back roads. They were in sort of a convoy with the RV, a transporter, and a couple of cars. It took forever to get to Gastonia, where I begged Wilson T. to let me out for a little privacy. That's where I got to a phone again. Then we went somewhere out in the country around here, and they kept me locked up while they worked some more on the race truck. This morning they decided they needed to do a practice run before leaving for Phoenix, and that's why we went to the Speedway. Wilson T. let me out of the back room of the RV to walk around up front, and when he was watching them practice, I got his phone and called Lillian. Then Bigelow found out I'd made another call, and he told Wilson T. that he was going to make him eat that phone if I got hold of it again. That's when you got here, Miss Julia, and just in time, because they were ready to leave, and I might have never gotten home then. Yes, you would have, Mr. Pickens said, those dark eyes centered on her. I'd have found you no matter where they took you. I rolled my eyes, but neither of them noticed. Oh dear, pheromones are in the air. All right, that's the end of this chapter. I hope you guys have a fun day today.